Alright class, in this video I want to talk a little bit about Michel Foucault and explain his overall philosophical project and how to... Foucault is, or I should say was, he died in 1984, but prior to that he was one of the sort of the intellectual stars of his time. His home base was in France, although he, as a younger academic, traveled around quite a bit to Poland, I want to say Algeria and Norway, I think. And then once he became more famous as a thinker and scholar, he began to take up visiting professorships in the United States, in particular at Berkeley. And he's often considered a philosopher, although one of the difficulties in studying Foucault is that the topics that he addresses are, generally speaking, only obliquely philosophical. But this is because of his own philosophical predilections. And one way of thinking about Foucault is that he is resolutely anti-Platonist. What does that mean? Right? So in a sort of a caricature of Plato, one might say that the Platonist is interested in pursuing eternal truths that are, necessary and universal, and sort of along the model of mathematics, and therefore historical events and historical changes are relatively trivial. History is not important in Plato. If you were to go and read Plato's Republic, where he's talking at length about education, sort of curriculum and goals and things like that, you'll notice that he never suggests that history is something that should be taught, because for him, history is ultimately trivial. For Foucault, being sort of resolutely anti-Platonist, everything has a history. Well, not merely things, but concepts. And what makes Foucault interesting is that he will try to show that the sorts of things that we think do not have a history, in fact, do have a history. There's a sense in which reading Foucault is a bit like reading a detective novel, right, where he's trying to sort of unearth, like, the secret histories of our times. And one of the things that Foucault was particularly interested in, especially in his sort of early academic career, was psychology. 1960s, he begins to take an interest in psychology. He actually trained a bit in a psychological clinic, I think in Switzerland, but ultimately he sort of returned home to philosophy and began to philosophize about psychology. And what he was interested in was sort of a resolutely anti-Platonist reading of psychology. Right? There is a tendency for people, and you can see this if you look at various history of psychology textbooks, to sort of say, well, there's always been this thing called psychology, and people have been doing it in their own way for, millennia. Some have done it better, some have done it worse, right? But there's kind of this ideal standard of what psychology is that guides the narrative of, the development of psychology, its progressions and regressions and things like that. There's this standard, we might say Platonic vision of what psychological science is supposed to be. What Foucault wants to say is that there is no such thing. In fact, Foucault would go so far as to say that psychology didn't exist, prior to the late 18th or early 19th century, that there was no such thing. And that if one wants to talk about ancient Greek psychology or medieval psychology or something like that, one is deluding oneself into thinking that something is there that there isn't. That for Foucault, rather than having this sort of continuous history of psychology, one instead has sort of a series of discontinuities. And what he's interested in as a philosopher and as a scholar is tracing the forms and developments of these discontinuities. So how is he going to do that? Being anti-Platonist, he's going to do this not so much by tracing the history of ideas, not by writing a history of philosophy or a history of psychology or history of science or anything like that, but by tracing out the practical, material changes, institutions, and structures that the people who developed psychology or whatever worked in, right? So being very anti-Platonist, he's not going to want to sort of talk about ideas up here in the abstract, but actually how ideas and theories are formed in concrete institutional structures. So when Foucault writes his history of psychology, which came out in a couple different versions. There's a thick, 800-page version called The History of Madness. And then there's a shorter version, sort of the abridged version, that you can get in a paperback called Madness and Civilization. What one sees when you look at these texts, is that his history of psychology focuses on, the history of what he calls like confinement, right? Of when did they start locking up people, or given that people have always been locked up, when did they start locking them up, in asylums? And what does the history of asylums tell us about the history of psychology and how we think about things like madness? Or why did we switch from talking about madness to mental illness? And how did the model the sort of the change in the asylum from something which was sort of like a prison to something that was more like a hospital? What caused those changes, and how did that affect the conceptualization of what psychologists do and what psychology is? Is it a disciplinary practice? Is it a quasi-medical practice? Is it just the study of human behavior? And if so, in what way, right? All of these questions, Foucault is going to say, are much more complicated than standard histories of psychology would have one believe. Probably one of the ways to get at this is and this is something that Foucault talks about quite a bit in the History of Madness or Madness and Civilization, is how the conceptualization of madness or mental illness, what we would call mental illness, changes from the late medieval period into what Foucault calls the classical period, which can be a little confusing because when he talks about the classical period, he means what the French call the classical period, which is sort of like the 17th and 18th centuries, not like the ancient Greeks or what we might consider classics. Like, there's a sense in which Foucault is very parochial. But Foucault notes that in the, what we might call like the pre-classical, late medieval, or even medieval period, what we would nowadays diagnose as, mental illness would often be experienced by the medievals as a sort of holiness. Person who has visions or hears voices or something of that sort would be thought of as someone who is like tapping into a transcendent reality, maybe God, maybe the devil, but something real, something profound. They sort of had an aura of the sacred around them. Fast forward a couple hundred years, and someone exhibiting those same behaviors would be thought to be, maybe fitting some classification in DSM. And what accounts for this change? It's not Foucault is going to say that, well, we understand better now and people back then were idiots, right? That's not an explanation that's going to intrigue him, but rather the conceptualization of what madness is, or what these sort of, whatever you want to call these experiences are. He'll call it madness or non-reason. Whatever non-reason is going to vary as the conception of what reason is changes. And as reason becomes more sort of instrumental and calculative and sort of economic in the classical and post-classical ages, then our conception of what non-reason is will equally be sort of economic, instrumental, and so forth. Which is why in one of the texts, the title is Madness, the Absence of Work. That as reason began to think of itself primarily in sort of economic terms as opposed to in the Middle Ages, where medieval thought conceptualized reason as sort of trying to understand the nature of the universe and ultimately of God, right? Sort of a theoretical view of reason. They ended up sort of taking a theoretical view of madness, so that the mad person was sort of doing the same thing as the philosopher or the theologian, but doing it in a non-rational way, in a non-discursive, non-academic way, but still tapping into those sort of ultimate realities. As the conception of reason changes into, again, instrumentality, rationality, economics, right? Then non-reason gets conceived of as that which produces an absence of work. So it's not surprising that Foucault says that the first asylums were the poorhouses. He has a chapter in Madness and Civilization on the Great Confinement, and it's a point in European history where the governments of like France and then ultimately England and other things began to just confine people, right? They just kind of lock people up. And this has to do with a lot of changes like industrialization. In England, there was the strange little thing like the building of fences where lords and nobility would just sort of commandeer what used to be public land where, any old peasant could go and graze their sheep and say, no, everybody get the hell off of this. This is my estate now, right? They begin to build these big Downton Abbey kind of estates. And they tell all the peasants, hey, you can't graze your sheep on here anymore. It now belongs to Lord Marlborough or whatever. Eventually, those peasants are going to leave because they can't, pursue their livelihood anymore. So you end up with a bunch of, just kind of hobo peasants wandering around. And this ultimately sort of leads to the rise of poorhouses. And, so people that can't pay their debts or people that are just kind of out and about with no home or no place to go, they all get sent to these poorhouses. Well, so do the people that would be, mentally ill because they can't function in this new sort of industrial economy of the Industrial Revolution in that time period, right? The person that hears voices and thinks they're communing with God in the 13th or 14th century, they could probably still work as a shepherd and be fine, right? And you might have to send someone to look after them every now and again and make sure they're okay, but they could probably function as a shepherd, or they can't function in a 18th century factory, right? Like, that's just not going to work. So their madness that in one socioeconomic situation was experienced as a kind of holiness becomes experienced now as just an inability to work. And since work was how we understood rationality at that time, right? So their madness becomes understood as just an inability to work, and they get confined into poorhouses as well, rather than say. So this is just a short example of what Foucault's sort of rigorous anti-Platonism gets him, right? We get this discontinuous history where what we call madness or mental illness is not the same thing in different periods, and that psychology did not exist in certain periods, right? So he's going to say that psychology is born roughly in the late 19th, early 20th century. He kind of focuses around Freud's time because he thinks that what happens with Freud is that, and there are predecessors, like talking about like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and things, but He thinks that what Freud does is discovers or articulates the theory of the unconscious, which then gives psychologists a thing to talk about and study, right? Sort of a unique thing that's theirs, that's the object of their science, and that is different from, the objects of other sciences, right? Because one of the things that happens and you can read about this in a text that he wrote called The Order of Things. One of the things that happens in the sort of the organization of the sciences that's going on in the 18th and 19th century is that each science had to have a particular sort of object or realm of objects that it's about, right? So each science has to have a thing that it's about. Psychology sort of had a problem because, let's say, sort of before the unconscious, he would say, before that was articulated, psychology kind of had a problem because what thing was it about? Well, we could say, well, it's about human behavior, but along could come like, Durkheim or Max Weber and say, well, sociology is also about human behavior. Or a historian could be like, well, history is about human behavior. Or an economist could be like, well, economics is about human behavior, right? So saying psychology was about human behavior didn't give it a specific thing that it was about. So then you had like the physiological psychologists in, German, like they had they called it like psychophysics that they were trying to develop. But they still had that problem, right? Like, how is this not biology, or how is this not anatomy, or how is this not, something else? But when Freud articulates the unconscious, right? Now psychology has a thing to talk about. Even if you're not Freudian, right? You'll still talk about things like, implicit biases or, automaticity of reason and things. But like what happens, Foucault thinks, is that psychology can become a science when it articulates this thing that it is about, and this thing is, unconscious, non-conscious, pre-conscious, whatever factors that influence behavior. And so now psychology can be like, well, we're about human behavior, but we're about actually the factors that influence human behavior. For Foucault, someone might say, okay, well, psychology sort of discovered that there is this thing, and we'll call it the unconscious in general, right? Sort of this generalized unconscious that influences human behavior, and psychology studies that. Well, hasn't that always existed? And then if it's always existed, haven't people talked about it in the past? And haven't they therefore been doing psychology? So, you're wrong, Foucault. Psychology has always existed. He would say no, because it's not just the object that defines the science, right? That's sort of the ideology of the 19th century and the 20th century, but it's also how the object is talked about that defines the science. And Foucault would say that the way in which we talk about, unknown influences on human behavior, sort of post-Freud, is radically different from the way someone would talk about it before Freud. And said it's so radically different that we can't really, with maybe a few exceptions, talk about the one as being the same as the other. So Foucault is an interesting character, forces us to rethink radically what we take to be obvious, and forces us to see that what we take to be obvious wasn't always obvious and had to sort of become obvious over a long period of time.